And the only one that I've been able to meet, to talk with, and it was early on before I knew what I was doing, was Virginia Hunter.
Virginia, of course, is just marvelous.
Oh yeah, and very strong, opinionated about
it.
Yeah.
Well, and I think her point of view was rather different from most workers. She saw.
She was the wife listening to the complaints and whatnot.
Yeah.
So she got things that others didn't know about.
Right.
But she really, I haven't talked to her in a long time. But she was very adamant always about my differentiating, which you picked up on too, making sure that I differentiated between the different programs, or use the phrase New Deal to cover them all, because it must have been people must have been very, I don't know, what's the word, that you were on relief or you weren't on relief. But just about everybody was. After...
Nearly everybody was on that basis,
Yeah.
And, of the few artists who were still selling, some of them resented the program very much. Well, of course, it was a competition, but they felt that other people were not entitled. But it's always been a point of judgment as whether art sells or not. But WPA brought up a lot of good artists who wouldn't have survived. They needed to eat, let's say.
Exactly. I spoke with John Jellicoe last week, and he lives in Colorado, and I talked to him on the phone, and he's up in the Raton area. And he was in the Raton area, but he lives in Colorado. And his daughter answered the phone and said to me, well, I doubt if he'll talk to you because he's very private. And so she said, Dad, I think you should talk to this person. And as soon as I said what I wanted, he said it launched my career. And then he started it. He was so excited about our coming and visiting with him. He said, I would have never gotten the job as the director of the Philadelphia or the Pittsburgh Museum of Art. He said it made the complete difference in my life. Yeah, and that seems to be the case.
That happened with a great many people. It's true.
Well, now you were. Let's kind of start at the beginning and get that on tape, so then we can ask you some questions. How did you get? You were born in Clovis. I won't hold that against you, sir.
Well, I appreciate that.
Being from Portales. And did I tell you that John Ridgely Whiteman lives north of Clovis in Bovina, not Bovina, somewhere up in there. And I don't know, he's on his 5th or 6th wife.
We get Christmas cards from him still. But yes, he said that you he couldn't recommend marriage. He lost so many of them.
Well, the day I was there, I guess it was the second time I met with him. I met with him, or just met with him one time and visited. But then I went back sometime later not to video, because you're the first person we videotaped. And we had to get him down off the roof. He's in his late 70s, I guess. And he was up on the roof putting on the ceiling on a new garage or something. And then he was going to leave later that day to go see his wife that was in a nursing home. And that he had met her, and they'd gotten married, and in full Indian regalia. He wore full, and shortly thereafter she went into a nursing home. So I said, what is it that you do to all these women, John? Are rich as it goes.
Well, I was in grade school with Ridgely and involved with the scouts, and I was into the bottom end of that.
As I recall, he told me a story about Bill Lumpkins in the Scouts. I'll have to work on coming back on that one, but it was not favorable for Bill Lumpkins. He did something wrong.
We're very fond of Bill. I haven't heard about him in a long time. I was glad
I saw him last week, and I told him we were coming out, and he said to be sure and tell you hello. He has just gotten out of the hospital with a cardiac problem. Lost quite a bit of weight. I don't believe he was using a walker, but he was using a cane. And he's probably our next one to interview. But he's been very supportive of this project, and I visited with him probably 2 months or so ago. There's this one restaurant that he goes to a lot, the Pink Adobe, which is right down that area where the Spanish market started in Santa Fe. And Norma, his wife now, of course, for a number of years, said she could not believe when she saw the artwork that has been chosen to be used in the Santa Fe Chamber Music Festival. That was a WPA piece. He did 3, maybe you're familiar with them: Spanish Village, Indian Village, and Anglo Village. And his stuff is so abstract now, or his transcendental things, but this was pretty realistic, and she thought that was really strange that Bill would do something like that. Well, tell us about your getting from Clovis to WPA or New Deal.
Well, to begin with, at that time, Vernon Hunter was teaching at Clovis High School, a part-time afternoon job, and so that I got to know him there. And then I was trying to get to UNM. The problem always is finances.
Oh, yes, yes.
And so Vernon recommended me for that job. And so I went to UNM and had part-time teaching and part-time going to school. And I worked, I guess most of the time I worked on 3 jobs at once to get enough to go. But then eventually Vernon came to Santa Fe and was in the equivalent of the WPA in New Mexico. Became head of the art department, or the fine arts and federal art project. Anyway, so that I was pulled into that as a county supervisor. So that I worked as a county supervisor for Bernalillo County for a short time.
Do you remember what year that was?
No. 38, 37, about 36.
That sounds about right in terms of the time frames.
It was before I
And so then eventually Roswell won't open up. I can't talk.
It woke up.
Woke up. I think that's maybe the right word. And so I went in as director there. I was the second director, and a man by the name of Sprague, an artist who was there for maybe a couple of months before I came. And Vernon, with Paul Hogan's help and others, had designed Roswell Museum and also arranged for a great many things to be made, the light fixtures and furniture and
Do you remember who did the light fixtures? Was it a fellow from Santa Fe,
Yes.
Ed Delgado?
Eddie Delgado did.
Good. I thought that they were his.
Yes, Eddie Delgado did those. And the
The embroidered curtains.
The culture, yes. What?
Culture.
yes, that was that was done by the women's project. I guess it was called the Sewing Project. But at any rate, they did the embroidery for the curtain, and
Were those local Roswell ladies?
as far as I know, yes, I think they were. And so that, and then, do you remember the name of the guy who did the woodwork?
No, I'm sorry.
It may come to me over here. But at any rate, then the furniture was designed by Vernon and made by a local wood project. And so, of course, the whole building was individually tailored. There was a mural in the ladies' room, which was really quite handsomely done. And
The chairs had whole culture embroidery on the seats too.
yeah, all right. And these, there were two of these chairs, and they went to New York for the World's Fair, and it took us more than a year to get them back. We was over and over trying to get them, finally got them. And then,
Do you remember who did that mural in the ladies' room? Since I haven't heard about that before, I'll check with.
I don't know, no. I think though that it was, Lee. There's the woman who did the very delicate work. She lived on Chinese Road, and then Vernon moved into her house later.
I'm sorry,
Olive Rush, I think.
I was thinking you were talking about delicate embroidery. If you'd said delicate painting in Canyon Road, I would have known you were talking about Olive Rush. Yes, okay.
Yes, I think
Think
that
she
was
did? Okay. Interesting. We'll follow up on that.
What else?
I have a technical problem. My batteries are dead on this thing. And I didn't bring any with me.
Oh, what kind
They're
of
little
battery?
bitty ones. They're not the regular.
Oh,
Okay. The building, we've established that maybe Olive Rush may have done a mural, so I'll check on that. Although interestingly enough, they've never mentioned that to me, and so I'll ask the people that are down there. And the woodwork you think was done locally,
Yes.
curtains locally. What about this women's project and the sewing? You mentioned in one of your letters about the women's division of WPA. What can you tell me about that?
Not much.
Okay. In fact, I have a request. A young woman who's just finished her PhD on the Hispanic artist of New Mexico asked me to ask you about the names of some women to see if you knew anything about them. And I will have to find that piece of paper unless it has fallen out. But let's keep going. You were the first, or was Russell the first administrator of the Roswell? Or this fellow that you said was there for a couple?
This guy was the first. Oh boy.
Yeah.
You have it there.
Mm-hmm.
He was the first. He was not there very long. And he taught painting to some of the people. And then I became the second director. About 2 years or something like that.
And was that a situation where Russell asked you to go or told you to go, or how did you get that position?
Oh, yes. He told me to go. I was working as a supervisor on a federal art project and in Bernalillo County, and going to the U at the same time. And then the Roswell Museum thing opened up, and so Vernon assigned me to that.
Now, was simultaneously the other 3 centers happening, or was Roswell the first one? I understand there was one in Melrose, Las Vegas, Gallup, and Roswell.
That's right. Let me think. I think Roswell was the first, but they were pretty much simultaneous.
And what all did you do at the centers?
Well, we had there were traveling exhibits that were sent out from Washington. And
Did you have to pay for those to come? And
no, well,
or did you pay the postage, or did
we
you?
paid the shipment.
Okay.
And these came out out of the Washington office. Takes a while to warm up to this, doesn't it?
Well, we'll get, and when I drive away, I'll think of some things that, oh shoot, yeah, because I'm taking you back. I mean, to
Yeah.
things you haven't thought about in a long time.
That's right. My thinking about them is, another angle. But
What is your thinking about them? What is the essence of it that?
well, the thing that is the essence as far as the pagan are concerned is at least that the artists were friends, lived together, worked things out together, and had a hell of a good time among ourselves. It was really quite good, and we couldn't understand that the people outside didn't know this, but they why? I really slipped. It's been a long time since I've done an interview.
Well, this is interesting that you would say this, because when I have talked to various artists and asked them if they knew other artists, many times they say, no, I didn't, because we all worked alone. Now, was it because of you being in a supervisory position that you might have had the opportunity to get to know more of them?
Well, that's probably true. Yes, I would think that was so. The only ones that worked together were limited projects where individual artists worked with other artists. In general, they knew each other, but of course, I was in the position of knowing every artist in New Mexico and Colorado, I think.
That's wonderful. That's why we came.
But we've enjoyed enormously your book, just having these names come up again. But the supervision really didn't amount to much other than solving a particular problem or simply conveying information or orders from Vernon. And
what can you tell me in terms of how an artist was chosen, say, to do a specific work for a specific place, or whether they were just told to, how were they selected and given?
Well,
Project.
Vernon selected people that he thought could do a particular job. He was pretty familiar with their abilities and with their work, so that he knew where to put them. And roughly, we had to have some kind of sponsorship for a particular job, and sometimes that came with directions on who the patron wanted. So that
Who were the patrons? Who was the patron at Brutalis on Eastern? Do you know? Supposedly somebody gave him $120 or something or other for the paint there at Eastern New Mexico University. I've never been able to find out who that was.
I don't. In fact, I know very little about the patrons. That in general went three ways in the sense that it might go to a general fund, to a specific fund, and so on, so that the patron was not necessarily known. No.
Okay.
But this was after the things kind of got going. We were pretty free in relation to that. That is, that it was known that somebody had presented $500, and then we would choose someone for that money.
Okay.
And also there was a good deal of presentation of things like materials, paints, this, that, and the other, so that, and then the project, the art project would choose someone to do that.
Were there always directions on what the subject matter should be based on the place, or was it just go paint? I mean, I know one of the first things Bill Lumpkins told me was, well, I just took some paintings in and showed them to Gus Bauman, and he said, yeah, you're an artist, go paint. And that was
That
it.
sounds like Gus.
Oh, his paper on some of his feelings about some of those people and their capabilities. Oh, he would have been sued for slander if that ever got.
I'd love to see that.
I'll send you a copy. You'll chuckle all the way through.
Yeah, I'd like to see that. Well, in general, the artist had his own subject matter, and so that if he was chosen, then he went right on painting or drawing in the area he was familiar with. But sometimes a specific subject was suggested. The most common subject was something
Turn this off.
of the area. The artist would be asked to make a mural for a certain space, and so they drew materials from history of Curry County or whatever it was. So that was a rather unusual subject.
Okay. I have been asked about the subject matter of our paintings, and they talk about how in many states and certainly the whole business that you know about, that it was very oppressive and socialistic and all this kind of stuff. I don't see that in New Mexico art. There's something that Vernon did over at Fort Sumner in the courthouse was the most oppressive stuff was the realistic stuff about the Indians.
Yeah.
And then there's a little bit up in the Towson courthouse that's the transgression and some of that stuff. But that's it.
But there was almost none of that.
Why? Why do you think?
Why?
Well, they were some of the best artists in the country. Didn't,
But, well, it was not the same as the New York school that became famous. Well, there were the Marfiacs, you know.
mm-hmm. The
But
New
their radicalism was so tame that you
I know.
could hardly notice it. I think this was an exaggeration in itself. The people expected it to be radical, and so they couldn't see.
It was prejudice.
Yeah.
A lot of it.
Well, yes.
But that wasn't the case in New Mexico, was it?
No.
I mean, I would think you could say, well, it was because they were so thankful to have a job and they were, you know, so happy. But that could have been the case in New York, too.
Oh, yeah.
But it seems like maybe it was because they were, I mean, everybody was told to paint scenes of the time, but scenes of the time in New Mexico could have been pretty oppressive in the sense it was so hard, but so was it everywhere else. I can't quite get a handle on why it was so
Well,
upbeat as compared to...
I think in general that the artists I encountered were glad to have a chance to be artists. I don't know that they were grateful. I mean, you know, if they hadn't felt that way, they wouldn't have operated that way. But any thoughts?
No, except the whole state was more or less like that. There were so many kinds of people that we were all used to it.
Pop Chalet said to me one time, it was a good time. There was a lot of loving going on.
Yeah.
That sounds like
That's a good
I
statement.
wondered if she meant all kinds of loving. That was Pop. She
She meant that too.
she did.
Yes.
Was she the one who had a painting for $30? And we tried to get hold of $30 because we wanted that painting. It was in Santa Fe in the store. And by the time we got the $30, a museum had bought it.
I
can't remove it.
Yes, the Metropolitan Museum had bought it.
If you've been in New Mexico for a number of years, of course, it was in the old airport, but now in the big airport in Albuquerque, the Albuquerque International, is lined with her work. You know? And across from our office door, our front door, the first thing we look at as we stand there is a big Pop Chalet. It was one of the last ones she did, of the little horses running across, and it's a big piece, those little horses. She was a character.
Oh, yes. Well, the general subject matter was not dictated, but sometimes someone would request it. There's an example of a specific thing in sculpture, like hand sculpture, were four portrait busts in Roswell Museum that were in the foyer.
Those are not very.
They're pretty bad.
They're now in the southwestern, in the History Museum. Roswell loaned them to them, and I think that they're so bad they really don't care whether they ever get them back again. But the curator or the registrar, Teresa Eby, said to me, "Those are really ours." But I've looked at them and
They were made as part of the building.
originally in the center there. Okay.
But as I say, they were pretty bad. And part of this is that artists don't like to be told who to portray. Also, in this case, they had to work from. 3 of them had to be from photographs, and the other one was Mrs. Church, which was done from mine. We were very fond of Mrs. Church.
She ruled the town.
She was, but she had 4 husbands, right? And so that one of the ones, I used to find a sequence on this. One was her childhood sweetheart.
That's right.
And one, her father shot through the door. And the third one was killed in a bar fight or something like that. And I can't remember about the other one. Anyway, but she was the most delicate, dignified person. And this was like her parlor was like the Boston parlor. And she was elegantly dressed.
She knew Billy the Kid.
She would, well, she'd seen, no,
Well, she knew all them.
no, she was living in
Said he was just a college
Lincoln. She lived in Lincoln at the time. Billy was there. She said she remembered seeing the dead bodies along the street as she came home from school. But
Okay, it was John Chisholm, Joseph C. Lee, John Hagerman, and Amelia Bolton Church.
right, very good.
Well, it's in the Bible here.
Good. Excellent.
Done by Turkin. What do you remember about Turkin?
I never
John
met.
Raymond Turkin.
I never met him. Those are the only things of his I ever saw. I don't know anything.
I don't think there's anything else. That brings up a question I wanted to ask you about Eugenie Chenard in terms of sculptures. She did a piece that was in the Coronata exposition, and you were involved in that, right? I have found a picture in Russell's papers at the archives, a photograph of him and her, and then there's a sculpture piece between the two of them. And it's a white figure, I can't remember, I think it's a woman figure or Indian figure. And there is a sculpture piece that may have been at Sandia School, then went to New Mexico Tech in Socorro, and is now back at the Sandia Prep, and I have yet to get down there. But I'm wondering if it's called The Maiden of the Desert. And Bill Lumpkins was the first person who told me about it. And I just wondered if that was the piece in that photograph, because it doesn't say what the piece is. It just says Coronata.
Well, that's the one. The sequence you described. That's correct. And I think some variation on Maiden in the Desert. I don't remember.
Of course, once I see it, I'll be able to know for sure, but I was curious.
Workmen like that. See, when the School of Mines was split off, most everything went other places. But workmen like that statue, which was put on the fountain, probably administration building at New Mexico Tech. And so that's right sequence on that.
Okay, good. Now, Eugenie also did piece down at Tears Hot Springs, the fountain down there. But I'm not familiar with any other right off the bat. I mean, there were not many sculptors. Is that because there weren't many sculptors in New Mexico?
No, it's because it was expensive.
Okay.
I think that's the answer, yes. But,
Okay.
and it was difficult to transport, expensive to ship, and
I take it back. I do remember two pieces in Santa Fe done by a woman, Hannah Mecklem Small Ludens.
I don't recall.
I had lots of trouble finding her because I kept going through all those different names. And when I finally found her husband, and she had died within the year prior to all the time I was probably looking for her. And he said they only lived in Santa Fe for about a year up on Canyon Road, and that the stone came from near Las Vegas.
I didn't know about that.
It's a boy and a girl. In fact, they're in the book. Well, go back to something you like, more about how did you pay for, I mean, these shows came through
Yes.
that Washington sent out.
Yes.
Did you keep some of the things, or did they
They
move
all-
on someplace else?
They all moved on, yes.
The Fine Arts Museum connected with UNM once asked me if I could find out about some that they had 3x5 cards on, that all said WPA on the 3x5 cards. And there were paintings that they'd never heard of the artist before. And when I was in Washington meeting with General Services Administration people, they said, oh yes, we know who those are. And so we decided it was a situation where they came out on a traveling show and never left for some reason, or they either liked those pieces and kept them
That's curious.
because they were definitely Eastern Seaboard, Midwest artists, not typical New Mexicans. And but they knew the names of the people and said, oh yes, they did work, and we can tell you where we have their other pieces. So it was very, and I didn't know if that was typical.
Well, almost all of the artists, of course, had worked somewhere else before they came to New Mexico, and some of them had been in New Mexico a long time. So it would be very hard to distinguish between those two groups.
Mm-hmm. Another person told me of a box. She was an art teacher in Farmington High School, and they got a box of paintings. I'm trying to remember all of this. And the superintendent was told that he could have the box full of paintings, and it was like 10 paintings or something, for $30. And he said the school could not afford them. And this art teacher said, I'll pay for them. She said, I didn't know where I was going to get $30. But she said when he decided that if I thought they were that valuable, then maybe, And when I talked to her on the phone that day, she said, and I do not, she said, so we got them. She said, but to this day, I don't know where those are. And then she got real irate. She said, and I'm going to go find them. And I've never heard from her again. So I don't. But was that typical? Would you send out, or would Russell send out things to places and say?
No, that was not typical. In general, well, the money was accounted for ahead of time, and this was so-called at cost, and so that somebody had pledged that much money. I don't know the far end of the financial thing. That is, that somewhere way back somebody transferred money to a
From Washington to Santa Fe, or to the region, and then to the region transferred it.
so that end of it was pretty complicated.
Was Russell's problem. Vernon's problem. He went by Vernon more than Russell.
Vernon.
Yes.
Our
Vernon. The thing that Virginia told me from the very beginning was obviously very proud that he was one of 2 supervisors that was there throughout all the projects all over the nation. Another thing that he was very sad about was that he could never get people in Clovis to accept any art to speak of. They didn't seem to think,
They weren't interested.
they weren't interested. They got one piece. He must have talked to somebody. Well, it was the post office, so the post office probably brought it in, and then the people got mad because the horse in the mural only had 3 legs. Do you remember that story?
No, I don't remember that. There were a lot of them. I did a review of a book on the federal murals, and some of it, not the review, but the whole business, some of it was very amusing. And the locals were very concerned about details. That this was a Yankee if it was if they didn't like the way it was painted and so on. There must have been posed for by the Yankees. There was an undercurrent in that, by the way, of Confederate versus Northern.
Interesting.
The whole thing.
Still in the 30s. That's amazing.
It never died.
Did you have to deal with, I mean, you paid the people for as the supervisor, or you didn't deal with that?
I didn't deal with that, no. I had to approve payment, and then this went to Santa Fe and so forth. But I didn't actually pay the people in person.
So did they get paid? Were some of them paid by the piece, by the and they would send in a bill at the end of the month, the number of pieces they might have done and how many minutes or how many hours because of course on the back of some of these paintings it tells you how many hours they spent on that painting.
That was for the purpose of collecting for sponsors. Some of these were sponsored after they were painted, and so that information guided the office on how much the painting was worth.
Ah, very interesting. Because it's on afterwards.
That wasn't always so, but part of the time it was.
Well, that's interesting because some of them have the hours on them and some of them don't.
Yeah.
And I wondered about that.
Some of them were simply, shall we say, probably just that figure put on, so that if or when the painting was placed, that was the figure used. But that was, I didn't have anything to do with that. And,
No, that was Santa Fe.
yeah,
We were out in the field.
Now, a person would do a painting. I just want to get the sequence, and maybe there was more than one sequence. An artist would sign up. Well, of course, if it was before the first year, they didn't have to be on relief, right? And then after that, they signed up. They're on relief. Then they're designated to go to the art project or something.
yes. They have to be assigned to somebody. And of course, there were very few openings on the art project. Let's say WPA and labor and so on, there were hundreds on, but on federal art project there were only a few. And this was a matter of money. This was so much money was assigned to that project, and it was divided accordingly. And that, well, in our case, Vernon made the decision. But there just were not a lot of us.
Did you do artwork?
No, oh,
Not professionally.
not professionally, no. Most of my
It was
talent
mostly the written word.
went into things like preparing exhibits. But no, I don't know how they got me in as an artist.
You must have impressed Russell Vernon Hunter very much.
Well, apparently I did. I'm amazed at that.
Now, after they were chosen, they were either told, to work on a certain project or paint a certain painting or just go paint, bring it back. The paintings came in. What happened to them?
Good question. Hundreds of them were stored in Santa Fe most of the time. And on the other hand, when possible, there was a place found for them that shall we say, Roswell needed a painting for a certain place.
Always public buildings. Right?
Yes.
Yes, it had to be public buildings.
Yes, public buildings, right.
Then that place had to agree to accept something,
Yes.
or they were delighted to accept something, or you had to twist anybody's arms.
Well, we didn't twist any arms.
Mhm.
So, and it varied. If they didn't want them, let's say they were Republicans.
That's one of those over there. I associate with her, but I give her a hard time, and it's vice versa.
Both of our families were Republicans. So, but they had to want the painting before, because we didn't hassle. We didn't. And well, I'll give you an instance on that. I worked with the Vernon Hunter exhibit.
We want you to tell us about that, so go ahead.
That was a terrific show. That was amazing stuff. But the Tribune and the Journal of Albuquerque never, as far as I know, ran a single story on that exhibit, which was the biggest and best exhibit that had come to Albuquerque up until that time. And this dealt with 5 states. And
Where was it held?
okay, you know the old library building at the there.
Old library building.
You know, oh, that's a story in itself. But,
Oh, we'll have to get that.
but anyway, that we redid that library. I came over from Roswell and directed the carpenters and so on.
Now, this was not Zimmerman. It was before Zimmerman.
As far as
Okay.
yeah, it was the original library building, and wasn't what did that called? Zimmerman. Was Zimmerman? No, was the other? No,
Yes, that's the big
separate building. Okay. So we redid the interior of that, and we bought materials for that purpose. Mostly timbers, rock, 2x2s and 2x4s, line the walls and make a place on which paintings can be hung and so on. And so that was a project in itself to get that ready to use. And then the exhibit was put on, but announcing it, we couldn't practically. I mean, as I say, the Tribune and the Journal were again WPA, so they just didn't run it. And it was a shame because it was a hell of a good exhibit. But
You'll be happy to know that the journals, one of the journal's art reporters is one of our best friends in terms of she pulled him in and he has given us lots of good press.
good, that's very nice. Well, eventually they recovered from that, but on the other hand, Roswell, for example, the 2 papers there ran anything we would give them. was running the local paper.
Well, there were plenty of viewers for the art show. It
Oh.
wasn't neglected.
Well,
But it could have been better.
it could have had more attention.
So you say it was 5 states that participated in it?
In the Coronado show, yeah.
How did you select the artist for that? Or did Hunter do that?
Hunter did that, and Ernie Ferguson wrote the catalog. But the war started and so on, and so before the catalog got printed.
So it didn't happen. Huh. I wonder where that is today. In her papers or something?
It's probably in my papers.
Oh, I can't.
And what are you going to do with your papers?
I don't know. You have any suggestions?
Yes? I would be most happy to make any kind of arrangements to get them to the New Mexico archives or somewhere in New Mexico. Sam Larkham is dying to get his hands on them. He said to tell you hello. I had lunch with him and this young woman who's just finished her PhD, and she had questions of you. You're a very popular man back there.
They've never heard of me here.
Well, you're popular there.
So, well, I didn't hear from Sam in a long time, and then recently, the last couple of months, I heard from him, and I wondered what the story is. Is he okay?
He's fine. The thing I've found about Sam is that he overcommits. I certainly wouldn't know anything about that, of course, right? And then so he gets off on something else, and then you bring him back and he gets all excited. But I don't talk to him that often, but he's all churned up again, and he's going next week to Washington again. And we're trying to move forward with the possibility of putting together a national show, a national gathering of people who are interested in WPA or New Deal. And so he's going to go talk to some key people in Washington. I've already talked to the National Trust about putting something together in relation to their show in their conference in 1999 in Washington. They're interested. So we want to somehow or other evolve this thing into somewhere that people will know where you can go to find things more easily. If you're interested in the Writers Project, if you're interested in, where do you go in Washington to all the different places? Some sort of, get it better organized so you don't have to go piecemeal. I don't know if we'll ever accomplish that goal, but Sam's hot on that one.
Well, say hello to Sam. I've never met him, but we
Well,
met.
he's a very little person. He looks like a little jockey with salt and pepper hair, and he's very wiry. He's like a little banny rooster that just digs into things. And of course, the portfolio, he eats, sleeps, and breathes.
I know. I've sent him everything I could think of on the portfolio.
He got excited one time when I talked to him not too long ago. He was all excited because he found a whole new thing about WPA, and it was the maritime records on ships. And so now he's off in that direction.
Oh my.
He found a bunch of maps and papers and things on this. But I think he'll never, ever get off the portfolio. That's his...
Well, he certainly now knows more about it than anyone.
I think so, yes.
I worked with that in a local sense that I supervised. Well, that was hot on the griddle when I was started into the project.
Well, tell us about that.
Well, this was kind of a mechanical supervision in that I would stay in touch with various artists, and Well, to begin with, we would send them copies or send them the originals of some of the portfolio plates, and then they would make 50 copies or something like that from that. And
Now, this is you would sending them out to Rydell or to Whiteman or to reprint them?
yes, well, no, because the portfolio will remain original, not printed. Some pieces of it were. But,
Well, I got the impression the renderings, her drawings were printed and then people colored them?
that's correct, yes.
Okay, so was that what was printed?
Yes.
Okay.
The outline.
Yeah, right. And quite a bit of that was done on Mike Lightman's press. But, where am I?
Well,
When you're talking about the portfolios in your early, in Albuquerque,
Well,
supervision.
we would assign individual plates to be copied. The artist hated this, of course, because it was, they had to do 50 or so of it. There were also funny things that happened with that. But I remember,
you told me one story that Major Claflin said that she painted 17,000 drops of blood today. I remember that story.
that was typical.
You were about 22, 23 years old at the time, going to school.
Yeah.
When I first met you, and that's what you were doing.
How did you select? And they were called copyists, right? I think that's an interesting.
Nobody dared call them that. No,
I wondered.
no artist will approve of that. That was true, and that also was the most difficult thing for them to make a duplicate of the same thing is asking too much of a creative artist. But that was a way of financing it. The portfolio could be financed, but easel paintings were something else again.
Now, I'm remembering. Was it that there was no money for the printing, or there was something there was no money for in terms of the portfolio, and yet you're saying that you could get the money for the portfolio?
Yeah. Well, the problem with the printing was that it was supposed to be done by people who were on the project. Originally, Whiteman was an example of that, although his father worked with him quite a bit. But these were, to begin with, the printers were rather more commonly employed than most occupations. And so it was difficult to obtain a printer who was on relief.
Really? That's interesting.
And so originally was an example, and there were a few others. And also the way around this was in instruction, for instance. What's the little school northwest corner of New Mexico?
Clayton.
No, I'm sorry, I've given you the wrong
North
corner.
direction.
Northeast.
Northeast.
Well, I went to northwest.
Northwood, Farmington, Aztec, Kirtland, Gallup.
No. the vocational school.
No retail.
Yeah, very good.
Oh,
Well, their print shop was used, and so this was a way around the matter of
Okay, makes sense.
relief. And this was probably true in several other schools. But that one I know was used, for instance, it was used on the portfolio.
Now, I read somewhere, or Sam told me, that Bauman's printing press was used at El Rito. Did he
I think that's so.
take that up there for them to use, or?
I don't know the
Okay.
details on that, but I think that's correct. Yeah, Gus Bauman was involved in that end of it, the printing end.
So they would, E. Boyd went up and did the drawing, the sketching, the renderings of these pieces. Then they were brought back, printed on printing presses, or no, woodcuts were done by Manville Chapman, and you mentioned someone else, a Fritz Brosch. I never, Brosch.
B-R-O-S-K-E-I-N.
I hadn't heard of him, but that was a new
He operated out of Las Vegas.
one. Okay. And then after the renderings were done, somebody made the decision to pass. Did they send out a whole lot of them to each person, or they just send them 2 or 3, and then tell them to get them back, or?
Well, they would send out, at least a dozen to a person. Sometimes people got stuck with all 50, which was bloody awful. And of course, as they got tired of it, they made more mistakes.
Mistakes. And they had directions on paint this color and paint that color, so that they were, in order to keep them the same.
Well, that was the theory. They were given an original from E. Boyd to copy. And sometimes they did and sometimes they didn't.
Now, I remember seeing one on Joy Fink's wall that did not get selected. She said it was not one that was chosen, and probably was thrown in the trash. She picked it up and said, "I'm taking that home." I don't know. But so I guess there were some that were not selected.
Yes, there were a few, perhaps half a dozen that were not selected.
Your voice is very soft. I'm having trouble getting it on this, but hopefully it's picking it up there without any trouble. One of the biggest problems today is finding those things. How were they distributed? As I understand, the first 10 were painted by E. Boyd, and then she sent them, or then somebody sent them to Washington, and
Then they went to Vernon.
then he made the decision where they went from there. The other biggest problem we've had in terms of trying to find things is the Jean Claus etchings and the lithographs that were done by B.J.O. Nordfeld. They seem to have primarily gone out to schools, and from there I've had great difficulty finding whether they're still there. I think they just kind of walked away in some cases. Don't know how those were distributed. Do you know anything about that?
Well, they were sent out of Washington, but I mean out of
Santa Fe?
Santa Fe. But, I don't know.
Okay. Did you get paid more because you were a supervisor?
Well, I think I got paid $10 more a month or something like that.
I don't know.
This was hard times. Yes, I got paid slightly more.
Being a writer, did you work on the Writers Project?
Well, I started first with
And you were just on that from then on. Why did, and you may not know this, why did Lloyd Moyland get so much work. His work is, in many different places in New Mexico. Beautiful, beautiful murals.
Well, I think simply that he worked very fast, and it also had a kind of universal quality so that everyone liked his work. And well, for a long time he was in the what's the Indian Museum in
Gallup
no,
in Santa Fe.
in Santa Fe. Navajo.
Okay,
Oh, yeah.
now the
Navajo.
wheelwright was
Yeah.
the Navajo ceremonial or something, yes.
Yeah.
Okay,
And
That's
Vernon
right.
used to call it the Navajo commercial art.
Navajo commercial art, okay.
But Lloyd was with them a long time and restored or copied, I think, hundreds of things from the Navajos. But this was before and after the WPA. He was kind of a marvelous guy and so very talented, very clever.
Well, we are about to embark on the restoration of the big mural at Portales at Eastern that he did. We would like to, there's one at the courthouse in Gallup that he's done, and then Highlands also. Then there are little pieces around. Gallup has a lot of little pieces. But these three big murals are, and as I understand the one at Portales, this is the only one I have a story on, is that somebody gave $120 for the paint for the one in Portales based on the fact that the artist couldn't paint on Sunday, and they chose a chapter of the Bible for him to paint, and he did.
Heard that.
No.
It's that mural is Ecclesiastes 12, and supposedly he was told not to paint on Sunday, and he got caught painting on Sunday, and the preachers came on Monday and to give him a hard time, and his response to him was, "What better day to paint the Lord's word than on Sunday?" Was that typical of him?
Well, I think it would be, yes. He was a very sweet guy. I don't know whether he's living or dead.
No, he's not living. And we have run into somebody in Albuquerque who was was family. Anyway, she has quite a bit of his work. And did a lot of studying about him, and so we've got to spend some more time with her. We've just kind of made contact with her, and then I found another man who has the home that he lived in, I guess. So he's very interested in Moylan's work too. Now, you were in Bernalillo County and you were in Roswell. Which were you first in?
In Bernalillo County.
Okay. And how long were you there?
I would say 3 or 4 months, not very long.
And then,
Bernalillo County?
When I was at the U before
Well, that was more than 3 or 4 months.
before I went to Roswell.
Well, you went through school at the university. That's 4
So
years, and then you taught senior. You taught freshman English for a year, and then we were married and off to Roswell. So you were there. You went through school in 3.5 years. So.
I have no sense of time.
Yeah.
aren't we glad that we have spouses? I have no sense of time, and my husband can just
Yeah,
Just
that's
tell me, well,
what
that
they're
happened in
good for.
19 blah blah, and then I
The
got.
aesthetics they're not too good at, but the timing, yes.
Oh my! And then how long were you in Roswell?
2 years.
And you were from, were you met in Albuquerque, so
Yes.
therefore you weren't familiar with the East Side.
Oh, I wasn't familiar with it at all.
So you took her to this desolate place. What an awful man you were.
Roswell? Well, it was an experience.
Well, that was before they had all those spooks, you know.
Aliens, yes, they're all over
Mostly
the
we
place.
had cowboys on their heels sitting in front of the bank watching the traffic go by. That's my particular
Take on
remembrance of Roswell and what it was like. Yes.
One of the, in terms of seeing all this, the distribution around the state, I have yet to find anything in Hobbs and Jowl and down on the east side, and I assume down in that corner it's because they didn't exist at that time, those towns. Or they were just little spots in the road. Then the oil boom came and they blossomed. Is that the case, you think?
Well, I never thought of that as an empty corner.
No, they were there, but they didn't amount to anything.
Well, why did they not get any art? Now, Carlsbad has one piece that's in the museum, but I haven't found anything. I mean, certainly Roswell had the Peter Hurd mural at New Mexico Military Institute that burned.
6 minutes.
How can that be? What?
Well, no, I haven't. But we never heard of those towns.
Well, there just wasn't much intercourse between those towns and Santa Fe, for example.
Yeah, well, right. Santa Fe was a world by itself.
Well, of course, I lived in it, but I thought since you were down there, maybe you would know something about that east side or the Little Texas.
Yeah. It's a terrible word. But I hadn't thought about that. I think that they were just one of the places that never got around to it.
They
You know?
didn't care, nobody cared about them.
So that and there must have been places like Kamado and so on
Oh, certainly, yes.
that are unknown.
They're still unknown.
I guess they are, yeah.
Now, Las Cruces, of course, got some pieces. Deming, Lordsburg, each one got maybe one or two. So those portions of the state, nobody was too far away.
Yeah, well, that was part of it. But almost anything had to be done by automobile, and it was expensive in terms of the time.
Well, Santa Fe was the center of art for New Mexico, and a very strong center for art. The eastern portion was not known for that. And
Where Clovis wouldn't take it.
Yeah. Artists tend to communicate with other artists.
Well, also, this was even true of Albuquerque, that Albuquerque was not an art town. It sometimes pretended to be, but it wasn't.
No, it wasn't.
As I recall, the murals were, placement of murals was done by a committee of Mary Austin, Bronson Cutting, and John Galmeen.
I've heard that.
So you don't know much about, I mean, they must have traveled around and said, okay, we'll let you do something here.
Perhaps even without traveling around.
Oh, okay. All righty. Was this something that you felt was an important thing in your life?
Oh, yes. that was why I probably could have gotten a better paying job, for instance. But I believed in the project, and I always kidded myself that I had sacrificed myself because I felt that should be done. But yeah, I believed in it very strongly.
Why? What did you do afterwards? After you made this sacrifice?
Well, let's see. I left the project for the war.
Oh yes, you left the project. We went up to around Chicago
That's right.
where he taught traffic driving for a while. And then we went to his family in L.A. And then he was a high school teacher of English in Espanola. And then came the war.
Espanola is another place I've never found anything. Did they get anything? Do you know why? Or,
Well, probably. This is something not to bring up, but I think this was a matter of Spanish versus Anglo situation. But,
That's the way they were.
and yet, Vernon was the one that found Patrocinio Varela, right?
yes. Yeah. That Vernon was loaded with prejudices. He didn't want any Indians in making him, for example.
That explains why in the mural at Fort Sumner it just says, and he had help or something, but it doesn't reference who helped him. And it was a Spanish-American person. Pedro Cervantes.
Yeah. Who did very well.
Very interesting. You have brought up something that I wondered if it wasn't underlying in there, but I didn't know for sure. Was that prevalent throughout, you think, or was it...
Well, I think it was probably.
So there was this elitist thing amongst the Santa Fe.
Oh, yes.
I mean,
Very much so. Well, you probably want to rest a while and then.
okay. We're, I think that we want to wrap it up by talking about how the project, how you've expressed how you felt about it, that it was obviously very important. I think we need to wrap it, and we may not be able to get all that, but we could surely get why you felt it was important and what it did for you or your life.
Thank you. It's yours.
Did it do anything for me?
Or to you. Does it do something to you?
Yes, quite a bit.
Well, it put me into jobs that I might not have had under ordinary circumstances. When, for instance, because the salary was paid by the government, then they were limited the number of people who could get into it and so on. And so I was just lucky to get into that and get some practice and things. I became, my first job with that was as a director, and ordinarily I had to work up all through the ranks and everything somewhere. But I think that the important thing was that it was in no sense monotonous. It was something that was interesting to do, and that I could shape my own needs or whatever. What do you think?
I think you met a lot of interesting people.
Oh, yes, that's true. Well, it gave us an immediate place in the community. And so that we were, quote, somebody that you could approach anybody on the basis of that job.
And you were just a young kid.
You know, yes, I was. I remember the first directors meeting I attended, and this had Mrs. Church and Paul Horgan
An impressive group.
and you could see this how dismayed these people looked at. Here's this little kid who's come in to run our museum, you know. And but I was gratified that the last meeting, by Mrs. Phillips, who was the banker's wife, and was a very difficult person, that she cried. I thought I had really tried to achieve something.
Why did you leave?
I had to go on from there. We were on barely subsistence wages. You know, that was, well, the top was $95 a month.
I remembered as 75 a month.
But anyway, it was different times to exist, you know. So when you had something like a hospital bill, boy, this was rough.
Where was your son born?
Oh, he was born years later in Albuquerque.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So
So he was not part of that episode. But, I don't know.
what did you you said earlier that he graduated from UNM in 3.5 years. What did you major in? What did you get your degree?
English and history.
And many of us graduate in something and never use that again. Did you continue to use some of your skills in your life as you progressed?
I think to some degree, but
Well, you did a lot of writing
yeah, that's true.
later on, many magazine articles, local
Yeah.
magazine
Well, didn't you
articles.
become pretty versed in the, or weren't you involved in the Spanish Historical Society or the Colonial Society or with E. Boyd or?
Yes, not with the boy. Oh, that's
Oh, we got another
They
story.
didn't always
Didn't see eye to eye.
no,
Okay.
didn't see eye to eye. Well, I was, I think, the last month or two of her life, E. Boyd forgave me. But,
Oh. What did you do that needed forgiving?
oh well, I was a definite competitor. What's the word?
Competitor.
Yeah.
Competitor in the field.
You corrected some of your work.
Yeah, I edited it. Well, this started very early, and this was, matter of fact, the portfolio text, but I corrected some of it. But Eloy did not appreciate that.
Oh, you got along.
Oh, we
all
got
right.
along, yeah.
You worked.
Well, now, how as you and as an East Side boy get to know so much about Spanish colonial stuff that you could correct E. Boyd?
Well, the hard way. I had a somewhat different perspective than most people did.
And we lived among the Spanish
yeah, we
people
lived
a
in-
great deal.
Thing, the Spanish neighbors, and so it was just something I sought.
And your mother was Catholic, so that you were
Very-
familiar with the saints and so forth, the
Yeah.
backgrounds.
Yes, my mother was Catholic, my father was Protestant, but yes, that was part of it.
Yes, it
But I
was.
knew what they were talking about.
Sure.
You
Most East Siders wouldn't have.
know. That's very true. Oh, yes. And But also coming from Clovis to Albuquerque, this was like an Easterner coming to New Mexico. This was another world. And, so, I don't know. But it fascinated me. I was immediately interested in it. I happened to be the one of the few people who was interested in the art end of it. So,
What other publications have you been involved in? I know the book that I found on the Spanish colonial work. What else have you done?
well, almost all the other things were just short pieces. But I was director of the University Press for 10 years.
10 years. Then went up to the Wisconsin Press.
Yeah, the University of Wisconsin Press. And so I somehow fell into the publishing field rather than one of the other directions.
It was a fascinating world. I think that's
I had a fine time all
Yes.
my life.
some wonderful people.
Linda mentioned that you knew Oliver Legrone.
Yes, I was.
He must have been an unusual person at that time in Albuquerque.
Yes, very much. His family was, well, somewhat old Albuquerque family. They had for years they had a funeral home, and this went down to various other members of the family.
Well, there's a Legrone funeral home in Roswell.
Oh, they're almost certainly the same family.
I've wondered.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
But Oliver and I were in classes together. And he was just a terrific guy, brilliant man. And one of the tragedies, I think, is that maybe it's not a tragedy, but it's interesting. But when his sculpture was unveiled in TRC, he couldn't go. They weren't allowing any blacks in the thing.
I think he said niggers. That's what he said. They didn't allow
Yeah,
niggers.
that's what,
Yes.
I'm sure that's what they said.
Well, let him say it.
Yes. Well, he did get to the unveiling of the piece in Albuquerque
Oh, good.
when we brought it up, and we had it bronzed, and it was redone, and a second one a copy was made, and it is standing in the courtyard of the Albuquerque Museum. So there's two of them, one at the hospital and one at the Albuquerque Museum. And he told the story at the unveiling about the fact that he couldn't go. And they pulled the cord and he unveiled it, and he turned to me and said, "I don't think that's the color I chose." But he was very happy to be there. And that story was very touching,
Yes.
very sad, very much of the time.
Well, he didn't have a difficult time at the university, though. Had a lot of friends. Many friends.
Now, he indicated he was the first black man to graduate from the art department at UNM.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Oh,